When my father, W. Cleon Skousen, was with the FBI, he had an interest in this new movement called communism. There was a certain portion of the FBI that was assigned specifically to look at the counter-espionage efforts and espionage efforts and the communist movement. But every FBI agent was trained in general on what this was, what this thing communism was. And Mr. Hoover encouraged all the agents to study it and learn about it so they would recognize it when they encountered it. So my father took a particular interest, and he took it seriously, and he dug down deep. And his exposure to it came through a lot of those who were in that counter-espionage unit. And he and they would have discussions back and forth, and he gained a great deal of insight. And he began to try and pull that story together. So right around the time he left the FBI, it was in the early 50s, went out to teach at a university. He had all of his scholarly research and his ideas. He being a writer, he loved to write. He had published books before. He had thought, maybe one day I can do a book on communism. When he got down to the university about 5 years or so later said, let's put out a manuscript on communism. It was showing up in the headlines. People wondered what it was. It was seen as subversive. So he was put on that committee. In fact, he led the committee. And after a while, the committee just couldn't get beyond ground one because my father had already studied all these basics, and these other people were just beginning. So he went to the president of the university and said, can I just be cut loose and just go do this because it's taking too much time? So he was given that permission, and he came out with a manuscript. At the time, the Ten Commandments movie was being finished by Cecil B. DeMille, and they had become friends. My father was a participant in the production of the film with some of the artwork and Arnold Freeberg. And when he was out in California one day, he brought his manuscript for Mr. DeMille to see. Mr. DeMille was interested in freedom. That's the theme of the Ten Commandments. Let freedom ring throughout the land, he said, had Moses declare. So he shows him a manuscript, and it had two titles he was working on. One was called The Cry of Communism, and the other one was The Real Story of Communism. Well, Mr. DeMille looked at the manuscript, and after a few weeks contacted my father and said, Cleon, what you've done here is you've stripped away all the pretense, all the fraud, the lies, the fakery that communists put forward to make progress. So therefore, I should call it The Naked Communist. That's what he said. So my father said, great idea. So that became the title. Here's an early paperback version of that. So that's the name, Naked Communist. And that book came out in 1958. Now, during this time period, there was a rather growing wave of concern about the growth of communism, the influence of communism getting into the unions in Hollywood and other media, other heavy industry. So the FBI was quite intent on trying to resolve this and trying to get it exposed. One story my father shares is prior to leaving the FBI, he came across a movie star, and she was in Gone with the Wind, and she was a sympathizer. She liked communism. She thought it was a more gentle, kinder way of running a country, and she gave them quite a big deal of money, large checks every month. My father was sent to talk to her one more time and get her to stop and help her see the light. So he goes to her Hollywood mansion. And of course, it's a big, beautiful mansion on the front, but in the back's a little apartment. He goes back there, that's where they lived, and he knocks on the door and she says, FBI again, I've talked to you people enough, I don't want to talk anymore. And he said, my father said, well, just one more time, please. And he spent 45 minutes telling her everything this country had given her, that the Constitution and the freedom and liberty and prosperity, free market economic, all these things had given to her in her career. She says, yeah, I know, and I've heard it. So my father said, okay, well, thank you for listening. He went back to the office, and he asked one of the technicians to do him a favor. Please get the tape recordings of the secret Communist Party, local party membership meetings, and spliced together just a montage of all the comments made about this woman. And the technician took him a couple of days, and so here's a half hour of all these comments. And of course they call her all kinds of words which we won't use here, but the money cow and the old this and the old that, and they called her a bunch of things and made derogatory comments about her blindly giving money and how they're doing so great. And they were. And they were getting from her $10,000 a month. That's the tune. That's the level of money she was bringing in. So my father got that tape. He went back and she says, "Hey, are you harassing me? Why are you bothering me?" And my father had a portable tape recorder, and he said, "Please, would you all I ask is you to listen to this tape, and if you'll listen to it, I'll leave and never come back. But I want you to know how you're being talked about at the meetings that you attend." And she said, "All right." So she disappears, and my dad's out there with his partner, and they're pacing back and forth. It's a half hour. After about 4 or 5 minutes, she came storming back out onto the porch, and she was, Dad says, cussing like a sailor, blowing these words all over the place, saying, "Those dirty so-and-sos, I thought they were my friends." And she was so angry. And she said, "I'm never going back to those meetings again." And my father said, "Here's an idea for the best acting part of your entire career." And that got her attention. And he said, "This is what you do. Tell me everything you know about the infiltration into the Hollywood unions. I'll allow some of that to leak into the press. And then you go to the next meeting and you have some of those newspapers clippings and you slam them on the desk and you just screech at these people and say, 'Somebody in here has been talking to the FBI and I'm not giving another penny until we find out who that is.'" And then turn around and storm out. That's just what she did. So she was covered. So it was that kind of exposure to communism that my father was getting. So when he got out and had a chance to write the manuscript, got it named, 1958 it was published, and the Hollywood period and epic of his life he was actually involved in. So incensed were some of the people in Hollywood that they presented 3 or 4 years later a thing called Hollywood's Answer to Communism. And it was enormous. There was about 40 or 50 major Hollywood stars. They held it in the Hollywood Bowl, about 15,000. It was broadcast over television, ultimately to another 7 or 8 million people as it was rebroadcast. And John Wayne gave the Pledge of Allegiance. You can imagine that great voice. And a great spirit of patriotism as Hollywood answered and says, "No, we want nothing to do with these bad ideas." The Naked Communist took off. It became a bestseller without going through the traditional book review process. Life magazine came out and said, "How is this possible? It hasn't appeared in any reviews, and yet it sells 1,000 copies a day." And it exceeded 1 million. It's well over 1 million copies to date. So it's a great book. It talks about the life of Marx, the influence, the appeal of communism. Why do people like it? Gets into a question-answer period section here. It describes dialectics, what are the forces that the communists see at work? Well, of course, it has nothing to do with God or a creator. It's all atheistic. And it goes into how the promise of something for nothing is possible if you'll just put us, the communists, in charge. And he shows how that has infiltrated a few countries around the world. Of course, the fall of the Soviet Empire has taken place since this book was written. However, all the remnants of communism remained in those 15 republics. And you can read about it in this, The Naked Communist, a bestseller, 55 years old, and still going strong. Ronald Reagan endorsed The Naked Communist, as did many, many other people. Some were in sensitive positions they could not, but Reagan did. A woman wrote him and asked about communism, and he recommended The Naked Communist, and we have a copy of that letter where he says, "Read The Naked Communist by W. Cleon Skousen. It is the finest work on communism in print."